Might be surprised to learn that the site of Vancouver's very first cemetery doesn't have a single headstone anymore, and that's not all.
Mike McCardle has the last word on the bodies that still lie in a place where you'd least expect it.
You would never, ever know it was here. All traces of it are gone. The headstones are gone. The cemetery above ground is gone. The cemetery below ground is still there. And right here under our feet is the grave of Mr. Smith. And right next to it, the grave of Mrs. Smith. They're still there. And over here, their neighbor, Mr. Jones. Hundreds are buried right here. And where is here? Right there in the woods of Stanley Park, under the roadway, under the bicycle path, between what is now the 9 o'clock gun and Brockton Point. That was the city's first cemetery. Everyone who died before the city incorporated, 1886, hundreds and hundreds, were buried there. And the new city opened a new cemetery, Mountain View, all of its very own. This was in the wilderness of what would become 31st and Fraser. If you go by the tea house, you will find the only exception to being buried in the park, and that was Pauline Johnson, who named Lost Lagoon. And she had to be cremated first. The forest was allowed to grow up around the old cemetery, and the headstones were taken away when the road was put in. Someone asked, do you feel ghosts when you go by there? No, not unless you know you're riding over an old cemetery. Mike McCardle, CTV News.
Never knew that.
Who knew? Yeah.
Fascinating story.
Little piece of Vancouver history.
What if the zombie apocalypse was real? Believe it or not, UBC held a talk last week to discuss how public health officials would deal with a possible invasion of the living dead. And we're joined now by one of the speakers from the UBC Zombie Forum, Dr. Jennifer Gardy, a senior scientist with the BC Centre for Disease Control and assistant professor at UBC. Thank you so much for being with us.
It's my pleasure.
I have to say, I can't believe that this is actually serious.
You know, it was serious, but lighthearted serious. Zombies, it turns out, are a really effective communication tool. When we talk about concepts in public health, like outbreak management, typically how an outbreak will unfold is you'll have a small smattering of cases, you know, just a handful of cases here and there, not really enough to raise an alarm. But at some point, you hit a critical mass of cases. People start showing up in emergency rooms, at doctors' offices, and between all the different types of surveillance systems that we have set up, everything from, astute doctors or people in the emergency room calling us to say they've seen something unusual, our laboratory, which is constantly running tests and looking for weird, unusual blips in positives for a particular condition, MSP billings from physicians. Those surveillance systems, if we do detect some sort of unusual activity, those will kind of go ding and set off an alert that will then trigger an investigation by folks like BC CDC.
Right. So things like, as you said, Ebola, or maybe the SARS outbreak that we had over a decade ago, that kind of thing?
Exactly, and SARS was really a perfect example. We talked about it a lot, actually, last week in that public health zombie lecture, as being a case of where the system really worked right. We had these doctors that were very astute, saw this unusual condition that they hadn't seen before in this part of the world, had heard what was going around on the other side of the globe in Hong Kong and the surrounding area, and put two and two together and said, aha, something's happening here. We need to isolate these patients right away, make sure what they've got doesn't spread any further.
So how do we prepare for an outbreak like that?
It's a great question, and preparedness happens on a couple of levels. Of course, here at CDC and UBC School of Population and Public Health, we are always preparing. That's our job, is to keep you safe. But it's something that individuals can take ownership of too. And when we talk about emergency preparedness, all of the same things that you would do for example, an earthquake, a tornado, some sort of severe weather event, all of these things are exactly what you would do to prepare for for a zombie apocalypse. Things like ensuring you've got water, food, medications, a first aid kit, talking with your family and coming up with a plan. You know, where are you going to meet? What are your evacuation routes out of the city? All the things we do in earthquake preparedness, for example, exactly what we do if the undead rose.
I still can't believe we're really talking about that.
Yeah.
If somebody in your family falls ill, what should you do? Falls ill with something that you don't recognize? Do you go to the hospital right away?
Yeah, that's a great question. Typically, again, you would want to go to the ER, but you want to take precautions to protect yourself as well. You know, in a zombie apocalypse, this would obviously be wearing some sort of armor, trying to avoid bites. But the importance of protecting yourself, wearing things like what we call personal protective equipment, really, I think the West African Ebola outbreak underscored the importance of that. When people are caring for sick relatives, if you're coming into contact with fluids and blood, saliva, the droplets from a cough or a sneeze, these are all things that can spread infections. So what was working in West Africa were people taking precautions, ensuring they weren't having sort of skin-on-skin contact with sick relatives, wearing glasses, wearing a mask, gloves, a gown, and making sure that any surfaces that somebody's that's been ill has touched are appropriately disinfected. Something like a dilute bleach solution.
Dr. Jennifer Gardy, thank you so much for sharing your information about a potential zombie apocalypse with us today.
My pleasure.